The highway was a dark abyss, blurred by a relentless curtain of freezing rain. A luxury sedan lay twisted like a discarded toy, smoke curling from the shattered hood. Inside, a woman sat unconscious as her life leaked away. Hundreds of cars slowed down, their headlights illuminating the carnage before they accelerated away, driven by fear. But then, an old rusted pickup truck pulled over. A single dad jumped out. With bare, bleeding hands, he tore the door open and pulled her out seconds before the car erupted into a fireball. When the sirens arrived, she saw his kind face. But as paramedics reached the curb, the man and his truck were gone, leaving only a blood-stained jacket and a mystery that would haunt her forever. Daniel Reed was 41 years old, but his body felt like a map of every hard mile he had ever traveled. He was a man defined by the quiet rhythm of survival, a single father whose entire universe was centered around his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. Daniel's life was a mosaic of odd jobs and physical labor. One day he was delivering heavy crates across the city. The next he was repairing faulty electrical lines in rain-slicked alleys or hauling debris from construction sites. He didn't have a career in the traditional sense. He had a mission. That mission was to ensure that Emma never felt the sting of the world's harshness, that she always had a warm meal on the table, and that he was always home by 6 o'clock to read her a bedtime story. His hands were a testament to this devotion. They were rough, covered in small nicks and permanent calluses, the skin thickened by years of gripping tools and heavy loads. To the world at large, Daniel was invisible. He was the man in the faded work shirt you passed at the gas station without a second glance. He was the silent figure in the background of a busy city, a person who lived on the margins of the elite's vision. But to Emma, he was a giant. He was the man who could fix any broken toy, and the only person who knew exactly how to tuck the blankets so the monsters stayed away. The night of the accident was like any other grueling shift. Daniel had picked up an extra delivery route to save up for Emma's upcoming school trip. The rain was torrential, a tropical-strength downpour that made the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. The highway was a lonely stretch of black ribbon, the water pooling in the ruts of the road. Daniel was exhausted, his muscles aching from 10 hours of lifting, his mind drifting toward the comfort of his small apartment and the sight of Emma sleeping peacefully. As he rounded a sharp, unlit curve, his headlights caught a flash of silver and the acrid smell of burning rubber. A high-end European car had spun out of control, slamming into the concrete divider and coming to rest in the middle of the lane. Daniel slowed down, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. He saw 3 other cars pass the scene. They tapped their brakes, their red tail lights glowing like accusatory eyes. But then they swerved around the wreckage and disappeared into the gloom. They didn't want the paperwork. They didn't want the responsibility. They didn't want to be involved in someone else's tragedy. Daniel pulled his truck onto the muddy shoulder. He didn't pause to weigh the risks. He didn't think about his own safety or the fact that he was already late for his daughter. He only thought of one thing. If that were Emma trapped in that metal cage, would he want the world to drive by? The thought was a physical weight in his chest. He leaped from his truck, the rain soaking him to the bone in an instant. He ran to the driver's side of the smoking sedan. Through the spider-webbed glass, he saw a woman. She was slumped over the steering wheel, a dark trickle of blood running from her temple. The smell of gasoline was becoming overpowering. Daniel grabbed the door handle, but it was jammed tight by the impact. He looked around for a tool, then realized he didn't have time to go back to the truck. He wrapped his forearm in his thick work jacket and smashed his elbow against the window. The glass shattered, raining down on his arm. Ignoring the cuts opening on his skin, Daniel reached inside and unbuckled the belt. The woman was a dead weight, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I've got you," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "I've got you. Just hold on." With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, he hauled her through the window, cradling her against his chest as he stumbled away from the car. He had only moved 20 yards when a low whoosh echoed through the rain. A wall of orange flame erupted from the car's engine, illuminating the highway in a hellish glow. He laid her gently on the grass of the embankment. He took off his wet jacket, the only thing he had, and folded it into a pillow for her head. He used his undershirt to apply pressure to the wound on her forehead. He called the emergency services, his voice calm and precise, giving the exact mile marker and the condition of the victim. As the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the sound of the rain, Daniel looked at the woman's pale face. She looked like she belonged to a world of silk and glass, a world far removed from his. He heard the screech of tires as a police cruiser approached. Daniel stood up. He looked at his hands, which were now covered in a mixture of grease and her blood. He thought of Emma. She was home alone, and if the police found him here, there would be hours of questioning, statements, and perhaps even legal complications he couldn't afford. He couldn't risk the authorities digging into his life. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want the hero label that would inevitably bring the media to his door. He looked at the woman one last time. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a split second she saw him, the man with the tired eyes and the bleeding hands. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, then turned and disappeared into the darkness toward his truck. By the time the first officer stepped out of his car, the rusted pickup was nothing more than two fading red lights in the distance, vanishing into the storm without a trace. Claire Whitmore woke up to the sterile, blinding white of a hospital ceiling. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a sharp contrast to the smell of rain and fire she vaguely remembered. Her head throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing pain, and her body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. As her vision cleared, she saw her assistant, Sarah, sitting by the bed, her face a mask of worry. "You're lucky to be alive, Claire," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "The doctors said the car exploded less than 30 seconds after you were pulled out. If it wasn't for that passerby, you wouldn't have made it." Claire closed her eyes, trying to piece together the fragmented images in her mind. She remembered the hydroplaning, the terrifying spin, and the bone-jarring impact. She remembered the heat of the fire, but mostly she remembered the eyes. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes of the people she dealt with in the boardroom. They were deep, brown, and filled with an ancient kind of weariness and an even deeper kind of kindness. She remembered a voice, gravelly but soft, telling her he had her. As the CEO of Whitmore Global Logistics, Claire was a woman used to having answers. She was used to tracking shipments across oceans and managing thousands of employees with the flick of a finger. But now she had a question she couldn't answer. Who was he? She asked the police. They had nothing. "He didn't stay to give a statement, Ms. Whitmore," the lead investigator told her. "No one saw his plate. There are no cameras on that stretch of the highway. He just vanished. We found a blood-stained work jacket near where you were lying, but it's a generic brand sold in 1,000 hardware stores. No name, no ID." Claire stared at the jacket, which was now in a plastic evidence bag. It was worn at the elbows, stained with oil and grease, and smelled faintly of cheap tobacco and hard work. It was the garment of a man who labored for a living. To most, it was trash. To Claire, it was the most valuable thing she owned. It was the price of her life. She felt a profound sense of debt, a weight in her chest that no amount of money could alleviate. In her world, everything had a price. Every favor was traded, and every service was paid for. But this man had given her the ultimate gift, her life, and had asked for absolutely nothing in return. He hadn't even stayed for a thank you. He had walked away from a billionaire as if she were anyone else. Claire spent the next 2 weeks in recovery, but her mind was obsessed. She hired the best private investigators in the state. "Find him," she commanded. "I don't care how much it costs. Look for trucks that were in that area. Look for men who work with their hands. Look for anyone who came home that night with cuts on their arms." Days turned into weeks. The investigators scoured the city, but it was as if the man had never existed. There were no social media posts bragging about the rescue. No one came forward claiming the reward she had secretly posted in the local papers. He didn't want to be found. Claire began to walk through the city differently. She looked at the construction workers, the delivery drivers, and the janitors. She looked for those eyes. She realized for the first time in her life how invisible these people were to her. She had built a logistics empire on the backs of men like him, yet she had never truly seen them. She started to wonder about the why. Why did he leave? Was he a criminal? Was he afraid? Or was he something she hadn't encountered in years? a person who did good simply because it was the right thing to do. She visited the site of the crash. The grass was still scorched black where her car had burned. She stood there in the wind, feeling small and fragile. She realized that her millions, her influence, and her power meant nothing in that moment of life and death. She was just a woman in the rain, and a stranger had decided she was worth saving. The mystery deepened her resolve. She didn't just want to thank him anymore. She wanted to understand him. She wanted to know what kind of man chooses to be a ghost in a world that craves fame. The investigation finally caught a break, but it wasn't through high-tech surveillance or digital footprints. It was a small, analog detail. One of Claire's investigators found a local pharmacy in a working-class neighborhood that had reported a man coming in late on the night of the crash, asking for heavy-duty bandages and antiseptic. He had paid in crumpled cash and had a young girl waiting in an old rusted pickup truck outside. The detectives combed through hours of dusty paper logs and interviewed dozens of residents who lived on the edge of the industrial zone. They were looking for a shadow, a man who seemed to belong to the very bricks and mortar of the city. Every lead felt like a dead end until they found a local diner owner who remembered a regular customer. A man who always sat in the back corner, quietly reading to his daughter. "He's a good man," the owner said. "Hard-working, keeps to himself, but his hands, they're always cut up from some job or another." And this was the breakthrough Claire had been praying for. The description of the truck led them to a dilapidated apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district. It was a place where the paint was peeling and the hallways smelled of stale cooking and laundry detergent. Claire insisted on going herself. She didn't want a report. She wanted the truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the concrete stairs, the silence of the building feeling heavy with anticipation. She wasn't just looking for a savior anymore. She was looking for a piece of her own humanity that she had lost in the high-stakes world of corporate greed. As she stood in front of apartment 4B, her heart raced. She knocked, her knuckles rapping against the scarred wood. The door opened, and there he was. Daniel Reed stood there in a plain white t-shirt, his hair damp from a shower. He looked older in the light, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. He looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly. Claire stepped inside, her expensive heels clicking on the worn linoleum. The apartment was tiny but spotlessly clean. Every surface was covered with the life of a child, coloring books, school projects, and a small pile of shoes by the door. Daniel didn't offer her a seat. He stood by the window, looking out at the gray city. "Why did you leave?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "I owe you everything. I could have helped you. I could have rewarded you." Daniel turned to face her. "I don't want a reward, Ms. Whitmore. And I left because I've seen what the help of people like you does to lives like mine." He sat down at the small kitchen table and told her his story. It wasn't the story of a criminal, but the story of a victim. 5 years ago, Daniel had lost his wife in a high-profile car accident involving a drunk driver who was the son of a prominent politician. Daniel had tried to seek justice, but the media had turned the story into a circus. They had hounded him, dug into his past, and twisted his words to protect the wealthy family involved. The stress and the public scrutiny had made his wife's final days a living hell, and after she passed, Daniel was left broken, his reputation tarnished by a narrative he couldn't control. "I learned that when the cameras start rolling, the truth disappears," Daniel said, his voice flat. "I promised Emma that I would never let that happen to her. I would never let her life become a headline for people to consume over breakfast. I saved you because you were a person in trouble, but as soon as I saw the police, I knew the story would follow. I couldn't risk my daughter being dragged into that light again. I've learned how to be invisible because it's the only way to be safe." Claire was stunned. She had expected a man who was hiding a dark secret, but instead she found a man who was hiding from the world's darkness. He had vanished not to escape justice, but to preserve his peace. But the truth went even deeper. Claire noticed Daniel wincing as he moved his arm. She saw the heavy bandages under his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, reaching out. "It's fine," he brushed her off. "Just some glass." But it wasn't just glass. As Claire talked to the neighbors and eventually Emma, she discovered the true scale of Daniel's sacrifice. That night, Daniel hadn't just saved Claire. He had given up the only thing that kept his small life stable. The injuries to his arm, deep nerve damage from the broken glass and the heat, meant he could no longer perform the heavy labor jobs that were his primary source of income. He had lost his ability to work his delivery routes. He had been quietly selling his tools and his few belongings over the last few weeks to pay the rent. He was on the verge of eviction, yet he hadn't reached out. He hadn't used the hero card to get a handout. He was suffering in total silence, willing to lose everything just to keep his promise to his daughter. "I didn't save you for a trade, Claire," Daniel told her when she confronted him with the truth. "If I had known it would cost me my arm, I would have still done it. Because my life isn't measured by what I have. It's measured by what I can do for Emma and what I can do for a stranger who needs me. You're okay now. That's the only ending to the story I need." Claire looked around the small, fading apartment and then at the man who had lost his livelihood to save her. She realized that she had spent her life building an empire based on logistics, the movement of things. But Daniel had taught her the logistics of the soul, the movement of grace. He had given up his future to give her back hers, and he was perfectly content to disappear into the shadows and be forgotten. Claire realized that her money couldn't pay this debt. She couldn't buy his gratitude. She had to learn how to honor his silence. Claire left the apartment that day changed. She didn't return with a checkbook or a fleet of cameras. She understood now that the greatest insult she could offer Daniel was to make him a story. She respected his wish for anonymity, but she refused to let his sacrifice be the end of his stability. Her billion-dollar logistics network, usually geared toward global dominance, began to pivot toward a more personal, invisible kind of rescue mission. She returned to her office and began to use her power in a way she never had before. She didn't announce a Daniel Reed grant or hold a press conference. Instead, she acted through a series of anonymous channels. She quietly purchased the apartment building where Daniel lived through a shell company, ensuring that the rent for apartment 4B would be subsidized indefinitely. She orchestrated a web of administrative changes that made it impossible for him to be evicted, transforming his precarious housing into a permanent sanctuary. She arranged for a specialized medical team to visit a local community center where Daniel was invited to receive the advanced physical therapy he needed for his arm, all paid for by an anonymous donor. She changed the entire culture of Whitmore Global Logistics. She implemented a new safety initiative for nighttime highway workers and created a massive anonymous fund to support the families of hit-and-run victims and roadside accidents. She did this without her name attached to the marketing. Every decision was a silent tribute to the man in the rain. She learned the beauty of doing good in the dark, finding a profound satisfaction in the absence of public applause. Claire began to drive that stretch of the highway every week. She would pull over at the spot of the crash, not to mourn, but to remember. She would leave a small, simple bouquet of wildflowers on the shoulder. Not for herself, but as a silent salute to the man who wasn't there. In Daniel's world, things began to change in subtle, unexplainable ways. A local scholarship was suddenly awarded to Emma, covering her education all the way through college. A job offer appeared for a safety consultant at a nearby firm, a position that required his engineering mind rather than his physical strength, with a salary that allowed him to work normal hours and be with his daughter every evening. Daniel knew where it was coming from. He received a small, handwritten note one day in his mailbox. It had no signature, just 4 words. "I am okay now." He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. He didn't call her. He didn't thank her. He understood that this was their silent contract. She had used her power to protect his peace, just as he had used his strength to protect her life. They were two people from different worlds who had met in the fire and the rain, and had decided that the best way to honor that moment was to never speak of it again. Emma grew up in a world that was a little bit kinder, a little bit safer, because of a mother she never met and a father who refused to be a celebrity. Daniel continued to teach her the most important lesson of his life, that the true measure of a man isn't the trace he leaves in the news, but the trace he leaves in the hearts of those he touches when the world is looking the other way. Months turned into a year. Claire Whitmore was a different leader now. She was no longer the cold, distant CEO. She was often found in the break rooms, listening to her drivers, ensuring their lives were as stable as the cargo they carried. She had learned that the logistics of a company are nothing compared to the humanity of its people. Every time it rained, she looked out her office window and thought of the man in the rusted truck. She didn't see a ghost anymore. She saw a teacher. One evening, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, working on an essay for school. The prompt was, "Describe a hero you know." Daniel sat across from her, repairing a small clock. "What are you writing, Em?" "I'm writing about a man who stopped in the rain," Emma said, her eyes bright with a secret knowledge. "I remember that night, Dad. I remember you coming back with blood on your hands. I remember you telling me everything would be okay." Daniel paused, his heart skipping a beat. "Emma, I told you." "I know," she interrupted softly. "I'm not using your name. I'm calling him the man who stayed invisible. Because I think the coolest heroes are the ones who don't need a cape. They just need a jacket to give away." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The silence in the room was full of everything they didn't need to say. He had saved a life and disappeared, but the trace he had left behind was the most permanent thing in the world. It was in the way Emma looked at a stranger in need. It was in the way Claire Whitmore led her empire. It was in the quiet, steady beat of a city that was a little bit warmer because one man had refused to keep his jacket. The story ends not with a grand reunion or a public award. It ends with a simple image, an old repaired work jacket hanging on a peg by the door of apartment 4B. It is a symbol of a man who did what was right, not what was easy. It is a reminder that you don't need to leave a footprint on the world to change it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is save a life, turn around and walk back into the rain, knowing that the light you left behind will shine long after you are gone. Daddy Healing Stories. The final lesson: we live in an age of mirrors and microphones. We are taught that if an act isn't recorded, it didn't happen. If a hero isn't trending, they don't exist. But the story of Daniel Reed reminds us that the most profound acts of service are those done in the shadows. True integrity is what you do when the cameras aren't rolling and when the person you save can never pay you back. Do not be afraid to be the ghost in the machine. Do not be afraid to be the one who stops when everyone else drives by. Your value isn't determined by your fame, but by the safety you provide for those you love and the grace you offer to those you don't know. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of quiet heroism, help us spread the light. Share this story with someone who works hard in the shadows every day. Let them know they are seen. Comment "human" below to honor the silent heroes who have touched your life. Subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories for more tales of hidden strength, radical kindness, and the beauty of the human soul.